Canada has a new federal government, and for the most part, it seems to be continuing on the same environmental and anti fossil fuel production path as before. Although Prime Minister Mark Carney is promising to make Canada an energy superpower. How is this possible? Joining us from Calgary to chat about this is Cody Battershill. He's the founder of Canada Action, a volunteer-led grassroots movement encouraging Canadians to take action in support of the natural resource sectors of our nation. Cody, great to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Of course. Now, why don't we start by touching on green power? Recently, we saw massive blackouts in Spain and Portugal, where there were failures in the solar-powered electricity generation plants. Both of these countries are majorly pushing for net zero, much like we are here in Canada. What can we learn from this?
Well, we have to learn that having access to 24/7 reliable electricity is something that we take for granted, but it doesn't come without risks. If you're not investing in having that reliable baseload power generation, if you're not updating your power grid, your power transmission lines. And the reality of solar and wind is that while they've played a massive growing role in meeting growing energy consumption, they are still intermittent. The wind does not always blow and the sun's not always shining, and in some countries more than others, of course. But if you don't have something to back up the wind and the solar, now the backup could be a battery. I don't know that we're quite there yet at the scale that people are talking about. To imagine having a battery big enough to back up an entire city for a really crazy storm for an entire week. I don't know that that technology exists yet at cost or at scale, but you need to have baseload power backup. Now, is backup a battery? Is backup going to be a natural gas power plant? Is backup going to be coal power in many parts of the world still? So it really just highlights that in Europe specifically, it's been said that Europe's going to need to spend $1 trillion or more on batteries, on new transmission lines. And it highlights for us that we need reliable 24/7 baseload, affordable electricity. Wind and solar can have a role to play, but maybe we want to be thinking about what's going to back that up when the weather's funny. And if we can afford to build wind and solar, but then also build a natural gas or nuclear or other power plants to provide the same amount of electricity that we're not using 24/7. And that's where the cost equation can get a little interesting. So it really just highlights again everything in our modern society. It's energy, it's oil, gas, it's power, it's electricity. And globally, coal is still at a record all-time high, coal consumption. So it's an interesting conversation for sure.
So, do we know if the federal government's plan is to keep natural gas power generation available as a backup to green power? Like you talked about the intermittent nature of wind and solar.
Well, yeah, and I mean, in Canada, we're lucky to have so much hydroelectricity. Like 60% of our power nationally is from hydro, and then about another 15, 18% is nuclear. Then we have a lot of natural gas, and we're fortunate to have so much natural gas. We're fortunate to have all of our resources. We need to utilize them. We need to use them. We need to make the most common sense choices to, have reliable energy, reliable food, reliable clean water, everything that underpins our modern lives at a cost our communities can afford. So Canada today is about ninth in the world for installed wind capacity, but we still are going to need backup unless we're going to be building those batteries. And I don't think the batteries are quite there yet at cost. So we need all of the above. And we need to be pragmatic in how we build it, thinking about cost, thinking about, supporting our communities, keeping the lights on.
That would also make our energy grid much more robust, too. Now, where are we headed in Canada with the Prime Minister's plans to go ahead with net zero electricity generation for all of Canada by 2050? Is this doable? And if so, what would the cost be to the economy?
Well, what we've seen globally is we've seen a lot of big plans like that have been scaled back or rolled back. And I think in Canada, if we are pragmatic, if we are realistic, if we are supporting all energy sources, there's ways that we can work towards certain goals without sacrificing, for example, our citizens' right to choose what kind of vehicle they drive, for example. And whether or not everyone should be driving an electric vehicle in the winter is another conversation. Where those electric vehicles are made, it's another conversation. So there's many different parts and components to this. I think it's great to have these big plans, but are they real? Are they reasonable? Are they realistic? Are they cost effective? And we've seen a lot of changes globally. So Canada needs to make sure that we are. I think there's some great stuff in the oil sands, for example, that we can advance with carbon capture, and there's some other great plans that exist that we can work together on. But nationally, let's make sure we're competitive to attract investment in all resources. Let's advance our clean technology, research and development programs that we're already leading the world in many different metrics. And but let's be reasonable and let's look at what's happening around the world, and let's not be an outlier where we're you know too slow, not attracting investment, not building projects. I think really the last 10 years would show us that we've lost a lot of investment in natural resources, and nationally our quality of life has suffered on many social metrics, and we need to kind of get back to that focus of building. Being pragmatic is really, I think, the most important thing.
Solar and wind power generation is called green, but I'm curious to learn how green is it actually? Can you explain to what degree CO2 is emitted with solar and wind power?
Yeah. I think we have to be honest as human beings that every single thing we do has an environmental impact. The clothing that we are wearing came from somewhere, and the food we eat, and the water we drink, and our homes, our gadgets, our cars, our holidays, our sports, everything is made from the material world. And so a wind turbine doesn't make a wind turbine. To make a wind turbine, you need coal, you need steel, you need oil and natural gas, you need lubricants, you need heavy machinery, you need massive cargo ships, you need mining, you need all of those different resource inputs to make that wind turbine. So, and then does a single wind turbine last as long as, let's say, a natural gas power plant? And typically, no. A wind turbine might last 10 to 15 years, maybe even 20 years, but a brand new natural gas power plant might last 45 or 50 years. So you might have to replace that wind turbine 3 times in the life cycle of that one single natural gas power plant. We have to think about all these different inputs and how much steel and coal and fiberglass, and then how do we recycle? How do we reuse? Where are we burying these things? And again, everything has an impact. Even hydroelectricity, when you flood the land to create the dam, there's an impact. You're flooding that land. But we gotta, as Canadians, work together, I think, to make smart choices so that we have, again, a strong electrical grid, so that we don't have something happen like that just happened in Spain and Portugal. We have affordable electricity. Look at Germany. Germany's electricity costs have skyrocketed the last 10 years. They have seen a massive deindustrialization. And what that means is massive manufacturing operations have left the country, have reduced their shifts, have stopped producing because the energy input cost is too great for them to be competitive globally. And there's a lot of other examples, warnings for how we balance these things. So let's advance wind and solar, but let's be reasonable and pragmatic. Let's also make sure that the electricity is affordable. We're supporting investment in all forms of energy, and we're not, missing our opportunity with growing global oil and natural gas demand locally for reliable energy that's cost effective, and also internationally exporting to reinforce our economic security at home.
When you were talking about lifespans of wind turbines, it kind of brought to my mind, growing up, in our parents' homes, like the fridge, the stove, the washer, the dryer, they would last like 20 years. Like you would never replace those. They would just be diehard. And now we're replacing those like every 5 years, every 10 years. And it's crazy. Now, on that topic, though, are we still burying huge amounts of old wind turbine blades and towers in the ground once they're worn out? And if so, why do they need to be buried?
I think it's a very complicated manufacturing process. And, again, that speaks to how much mining in oil and gas and petrochemicals are involved in the, construction and transportation, installation, and then decommissioning of those products. About 80% of the world's solar panels come from China. So those are made in China. Now, what is powering the factories that make those solar panels? There's been many reports that said a lot of those factories are powered by coal power. And there is still growing coal power demand globally. So, as Canadians, one pragmatic solution is to export as much liquefied natural gas as we can to make sure the world has access to many different suppliers. They're not reliant on one supplier that might not be reliable. And then maybe bring the costs and the guarantee of that supply uh, uh, so that countries like Japan and South Korea and China and all these other nations that have said they want our LNG, so they can choose to maybe build natural gas power plants instead of coal power plants. Um, and at the same time, when we're looking at wind and solar, yeah, that has a role to play. But when those products are at the end of their life cycle, certainly, we need to continue to figure out how we're going to recycle, how we're going to reuse. Like there's a lot, like our electronics at home are nowadays often, some of them, unfortunately, I think end up in the landfill, and some of them are recycled or they're sent overseas to be recycled. But it's just crazy to think that your TV might end up, it comes here on a boat and then you use it and then it goes somewhere else on a boat and then it's dismantled. It's very complicated. So again, everything has an environmental impact.
Now, you had a poll done recently which showed that 68% of Canadians think Canada should make a greater effort to export our energy. Question is, if our federal government doesn't build a coast-to-coast pipeline, will we be able to expand our exports?
Well, this is really the head scratcher, is that as a country, we have the world's third largest oil reserves, but we are reliant on 500,000 barrels of oil imports per day, mostly out east. Ontario's reliant on a pipeline that starts in Canada but goes through the US to get back into Ontario. And, we have to think about our energy security. We have to ask ourselves, why are we buying oil from Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the United States, all these other
Right.
countries when we have our own oil? And, Energy East would have seen that conduit, that pipeline built from Alberta east. It would have also led to more updates and investments in refining so that our refineries could process our oil. And, the energy ecosystem is very complicated, from production to transportation to refinery back to the gas tank or back to the petrochemical facility that makes all the products, the inputs for the products in our homes. It's very complicated, but as Canadians, we have to be talking about building more export capacity, reach Asia, to reach India, to reach Europe, to get ourselves less reliant on the United States as a single customer. And we also have to be absolutely talking about how we get more Canadian made resources to Canadian consumers in other parts of the country. It's a wild stat. It's a wild stat. Canada has imported something like $500 billion of oil in the last many decades. And we have our own.
Wow.
So I think we need to be thinking about nation building.
So my follow-up question to that is, what's the point of building pipelines if there's an emissions cap, which is essentially a production cap?
Yeah, the production cap is very concerning. And many independent third parties and industry associations have come out and said, if this happens as proposed, it will be a production cap. So let's be clear. Let's also be clear that we're the only country in the world talking about doing this. We are the world's largest democratic holder of oil reserves. The world needs our energy. Europe's asking, Asia's asking, many countries are asking. We're also the top supplier of oil to the United States. If they don't buy it from us, they buy it from other countries that aren't as friendly. They don't do as much trade with. That's a whole nother discussion. So, yeah, why would we limit any Canadian made resource or product? Like, why would we limit Canadian vehicles? Why would we limit Canadian tourism? Why would we limit Canadian food production, forestry production, mining? Why would we limit Canadian energy? It's our largest export. And as our largest export, it helps us bring in money to pay for all the things we import. And that's really, really important. From a economic balance standpoint and from a foreign currency standpoint, supporting the value of our dollar. So the production cap makes no sense. We are an outlier. We're the only country in the world doing it, according to Minister Guilbeault, and it doesn't make any sense. It needs to go. It sends the wrong message to investors, to companies, and to workers about this pragmatic approach that we need to have, supporting all forms of energy, and recognizing that our economy nationally is not looking too great. We really need to, get all hands on deck here. And oil and gas is a massive economic engine that is irreplaceable. And global demand's growing, so let's make the smart decision.
Cody Battershill is the founder of Canada Action. Cody, thanks so much for your time today.
Always, thanks for having me. Appreciate your time.